Asia, home to 60% of the world's population, with the highest economic growth and investment in industries such as science, technology, and education. Today, we're boots on the ground in one of the most important regional blocs here in Asia, being Southeast Asia. We're really focusing in on the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN. This is a very important alliance here in this region when you look at geography, demographics, and economic growth. Now, just 50 years ago, the collective GDP of all of these 11 nations was about $30 billion. And as of last year, 2022, we're looking at closer to $3.6 trillion. This is a massive growth story here in Asia. We'll be going over South China Sea, the ties with Russia, potential Timor-Leste, membership integration, and the war in Myanmar, much more, understanding all these nations from a global significance point of view. Let's get into it. Before we kick off the full presentation, it's very important that you understand these 10 nations from a geographical point of view. As Napoleon said, to understand a nation's geography is to know its foreign policy. So with these 10 nations, they all really surround here a vitally important point that has been a lot in the news recently, the South China Sea. Really in the northeast here, we have Taiwan just kind of lingering there. We're going to kick it off here with Indonesia. Now, why is Indonesia the most important one out of all these 10 you need to understand? Number one, they're actually the fourth most populous country in the world. Currently, China and India are about tied at 1.4 billion. India recently surpassed them. And then beyond that, we have the United States as the third most populous country. Right after that, we have Indonesia and then Pakistan, actually. So very interesting from a demographic and geography point of view to understand all this in context, right? In 2023, moving into 2024, this is vitally important. We have a lot of demographic boom in these Southeast Asian nations. And really out of these 10 countries in ASEAN, there's only one in Southeast Asia that is not included in this block, and that is Timor-Leste. I'll get to that a little bit later. But first off here, like I said, Indonesia is incredibly important. There's a lot of meetings here in Jakarta when it comes to ASEAN nations, also in Phnom Penh in Cambodia. Next, we'll move on to Singapore, really a banking hub, super important. Then Malaysia with capital Kuala Lumpur. Really interesting when it comes to foreign direct investments. The smallest country out of all these is Brunei, really a small kingdom, similar to Cambodia. It's very kind of isolated from the rest of the world. Not a lot of people know about it, but it is kind of a banking hub if you're familiar with Asia. We have Philippines here, which a little bit closer tied with the United States when it comes to the foreign policy on the South China Sea and the South Pacific in general. Then we'll move over. So these are really the five you want to understand that are not necessarily on the mainland. So you have Malaysia, Singapore, Brunei, Indonesia, and the Philippines. Then on the mainland, you have the five that we really need to focus on. The three that are most important, in my personal opinion, are Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia. And then you have Laos and Myanmar. Now, Myanmar is the one that's most kind of controversial at the moment. They've had some issues with getting to all the meetings with all these nations because currently they're still under this military conflict with the military junta controlling a lot of the nation there, a lot of border disputes since right in between India and China. A lot to talk about there, but since I'm currently in this region of the world, I'm not going to get too in-depth on here just so no feathers are ruffled at all. So let's hop over to the main PowerPoint presentation, and we'll dive a bit more into the fundamentals and the sentimentals when it comes to Southeast Asian nations and the ASEAN countries. Let's go. All right, kicking it off here, if you've spent any time at all in any of these 10 countries, you will see it all over the main capitals. You'll see flags flying of all these 10 countries. I really love all of this gathering, and really what I'll be covering in this PowerPoint is mostly the fundamentals first, then we'll move into some sentiment, some technical analysis, and then really lastly, I'll end it with basically my personal perspective, traveling here, some boots on the ground opinions, and then really just overall conclusion. And with this series, I'm planning to cover many more alliances after this, and then really the three countries that I'm most interested in each of these alliances as follow-up videos. So if you have any questions, any comments, or anything that you would like me to improve with this video series, let me know down below in the comments. Also, if you enjoy the video, obviously like it and subscribe to the channel. So getting it started here. So ASEAN was actually established on August 8th, 1967. So they just celebrated the 56th anniversary earlier this month when I'm recording this. Currently, it is August 29th, 2023. Next, we'll move into on the slides after this, basically the global significance when it comes to a population perspective. So when it comes to looking at demographics moving forward, and then also economic global significance at GDP. Now, personally, I do like to look at things usually at GDP in nominal terms, clearly, and then also PPP, which is purchasing power parity, which is a little bit better of a way to understand things, as there can be some complications when you look at GDP and how it's all calculated. We'll get to that in a later video. So Southeast Asia growth trends in general. So remember when I say Southeast Asia, there's actually 11 countries, with Timor-Leste is included in there, but ASEAN only has 10 countries at the moment. Timor-Leste is trying to enter. Myanmar is kind of on the edge when you look at it, but we'll cover that. Demographics and GDP, it's very, very interesting actually. Around the median age in the Southeast Asia is about 30, so much less than when you look at Europe and some of these other continents around the world are really economic blocks that a lot of people focus on. After that, we'll go over the ties with China, which are very, very important just from a geographic perspective, geopolitical perspective, because obviously the United States would like to have a lot of influence here. They have a lot more influence in the Philippines and some other places, whereas China is a lot more close to Cambodia, Myanmar, Laos, Thailand. So really the Southeast Asian countries were the first movers in the Belt and Road Initiative, here the BRI, and then also they advocate the Global Security Initiative and the Global Development Initiative. Now, the GSI is more focused on having global peace, a bit controversial to some, and then the Global Development Initiative is really focused on connecting all this. So the new Silk Road really connecting a lot of the Central Asian nations, connecting a lot of places like Mongolia, Russia, Southeast Asia all together on the mainland. Halford Mackinder talks about this as the world island. It's really he who controls the world island controls the world, he would say. And this is really the main thing. So controlling the means of production, controlling the energy supply, and really if you look at just the globe in general, that's where the majority of the land mass is, and a majority of the natural resources actually sits in this world island. I've actually made a video on this on the past, so you can check that out, but that was called The War of the Heartlands. Next, we'll go over some things about different opportunities in Southeast Asia from a fundamental perspective and a business perspective. So about 50% of the current population of Southeast Asia is actually unbanked, similar to Latin America and Africa, actually, as of 2023. So this is very, very interesting as China is pushing a lot with this. They've already made a lot of moves, and I'll talk about this later, towards de-dollarization, which is a current trend you've been seeing. I've been talking about this on the channel for some time now, but it makes sense, right? I think it's Lula who said, he remains awake every night wondering why all countries around the world trade in US dollars, which is very, very interesting, right? If you have nothing to do with the US, if you're Brunei in Cambodia, why, if you're trading with each other, do you need to use some other third-party country's currency? Why can't you just use cross-border payments, which they're already implementing here in Southeast Asia? Whether that's good or bad, I'll leave that up to you. Main thing here is talking about some objective analysis, not as much my opinion. I'll save that towards the end of the video. So moving on, the South China Sea Code of Conduct. As you can see in the beginning of the video, the geographical perspective is incredibly important. All these nations kind of surrounding the South China Sea. And lastly, I'll cover a little bit on the Timor-Leste membership. It's not as important, but they did talk a lot about that in the meetings this year. So boom. Moving on to member global significance. I'll talk about kind of the top three and the bottom three here, just to get a little perspective. Obviously, you can pause this and look at all of it if you would like, but these are all rounded numbers, of course. So you have Indonesia, like I said, the fourth most populous country in the world. You have India, China, United States, then Indonesia, and then Pakistan. So Indonesia has about 277 million people, the Philippines 117, Vietnam 99. All of these have booming demographics, so that means the birth rates are up. Really, the population pyramid is a normal population pyramid, where it's just traditional, whereas a lot of these other countries are inverted population pyramids, like if you look at Italy, or a place like Japan, they have very, very bad demographics issues. This is the first time in history where the population pyramid is inverted, meaning the majority of the population is actually going into retirement rather than the majority of the population be in the newly borns, right? So going in, entering the workforce, entering the education, whereas you do have that in Southeast Asia where demographics are looking quite nice. Then when we look at GDP, you can see the numbers here. Run those down, boom. And obviously there's some big, big interesting things you can see here when it comes to the actual GDP of Brunei. I mean, this kingdom is very, very interesting when it comes to banking. I'll cover that more potentially in a later video if you want me to, but what I'm planning on with this series is to cover Vietnam, Cambodia, and then Indonesia, because I think those are the three most important here. Myanmar, Laos, Brunei, not as interesting. I mean, obviously it depends on what perspective you're looking at it from, but from an investment perspective, not as interesting just because it's a lot of things that are blocked for foreigners for investing, but a lot of FDI is flowing into Vietnam. I spent a significant amount of time there, same with the Philippines and a lot of these other countries. So I'm moving on here. So ASEAN growth trend. So Southeast Asia is on course to become the world's largest single market by 2030. This is very interesting. Some may disagree, some may agree, but that's what a lot of people are looking at. That's why a lot of foreign direct investment is flowing here. I can tell you from personal perspective that I've visited a lot of these places where there's giant buildings, giant things built, whole things similar to Turkey, actually, where they have kind of almost like ghost cities, like in China, where these giant housing developments, nobody in it. Somebody has dumped a ton of money into building super, super nice homes, super nice developments, and nobody's currently in it. They built this to be kind of outside of places, for example, like Ho Chi Minh City or Saigon, whatever you want to call it. These are sitting empty, and it really, really is interesting to see the growth here, to see the boom because things are still lots underdeveloped. It's still much a cash market. But obviously, as you get into more developed cities, you'll see different things with mobile banking, with QR codes, all these different things. So combined, the members have a total population of 662 million and a GDP of $3.2 trillion in US terms, and that's nominal. So median age in Southeast Asia is 30 years, as I said before, substantially less than in China, which is 38.4. Also, you have to keep in mind that China has a massive issue with a lot of the male population, not a lot of the female population, and relatively low birth rates. And then Europe, the median age is actually 44. So that's quite concerning. A lot of people on pensions. And I'll say that for another video. So the region has benefited from geopolitical positioning between the US and China. This has moved both superpowers to deepen ties. That is very true. And then sectors to watch, in my personal opinion, when you're looking at this, obviously the digital economy being the unbanked issue, and also a lot of issues with getting physical US dollars in the countries, but US dollar is still very king in a lot of these different nations around the ASEAN bloc. So also you have manufacturing, so a lot of the manufacturing moving out, the capital flight out of China. A lot of people are actually just moving it to Vietnam because it's very easy. You just literally have a land border. Instead of shipping everything, let's say, to Mexico, you have the opportunity to, let's say you want to move out of China, just like a lot of companies are moving out of Russia. People are moving out of Russia into Kazakhstan, actually. People are moving out of China into Vietnam, right? So if you have things you can actually keep on land and just ship from there, that's where a lot of people are going. There's a giant boom in Vietnam of FDI, of a lot of these things, business sectors, a lot. Personally have some businesses in the agricultural sector and a few different sectors. So Vietnam is definitely one to watch. Also Cambodia here is quite interesting. Then obviously tourism. You have a ton of people obviously moving to Thailand, Philippines, Malaysia's a big one, Indonesia right now with Bali, and a lot of opportunities there. So moving on from there. So the ASEAN-China Week, this was very interesting. So they talked about a forward-looking ASEAN-China comprehensive strategic partnership in the new era. That's a mouthful. Okay, so China plus ASEAN. China and ASEAN leaders stress multilateralism. So what that means basically is bilateral trade would be, let's say, between the US and Canada, right? So two countries trading between each other. Trilateral would be, let's say, like China, Russia, Mongolia. So three different countries trading together. Multilateralism, same with multipolar worlds. People talk about this unipolar shifting into a multipolar world where there's one premier power, which currently is the United States of America. Before this, it was the US and the Soviet Union. But a lot of people are calling for this multipolar world, which there's many different superpowers. So maybe that could look something like China, India, United States, kind of all controlling in their own way, and some people having different powers in the global south. But multilateralism, essentially just meaning that between these 10 nations plus China, you have a lot of different trade potentially going on. There's also the ASEAN Plus 3 initiative. So this is, if I recall, it's China, Japan, one other, maybe India in there, and then the ASEAN countries. So all together trading right in between. So multilateralism is incredibly important. So it's not just an isolated world where I only trade with you, we only get along that way, but multilateral trade is vital for the world moving forward. And then boosting regional along with global development. So that's very important. So obviously the region there, boosting trade there, but then also a lot of these ASEAN countries are actually making ties with Latin America, making ties with Africa, with Central Asia. And a lot of these deals are actually being brokered by China, sometimes behind the scenes, sometimes they're actually heading off these. So then we move into calls for members to raise standards of high quality BRI cooperation. So again, with BRI, that's a Belt and Road Initiative. So the Belt and Road Initiative is about, 10 or 11 years old, something like that. You have to keep in mind ASEAN is about 56 years old. A lot of these countries went through a lot of hardships in the 60s, really through the 90s, and still are going through a lot of hardship, especially if you travel here, travel through Myanmar, travel through Laos, you'll see a lot of hardship still going on, a lot of poverty still. But the whole idea here is these nations are really developing, whereas a lot of already developed countries are kind of just pulling themselves down. I mean, look at what's going on in Canada, United States, Europe, kind of just pulling themselves down, a lot of infighting, whereas here, the whole idea is, hey, we're going to expand, we're getting things ready for the new generation, setting things up for the future, not as much as pulling down things from the past. Then advance key projects, so different infrastructure projects that are part of the GDI, Global Development Initiative, that China really promotes, along with the New Silk Road. And then promotes growth sectors in the digital economy, green, and new energy. Then Xi stressed China's readiness to cooperate with Malaysia to support ASEAN's central role in rejecting the Cold War mentality, meaning there's being kind of different blocks around the world, not being able for everyone to get along. I won't spend too much time on that. A little bit more controversial, but all these I will have, if you would like, a link down below that I'll have this full PowerPoint set up so you can actually click the links for the references here. I think you maybe just have to enter some information and you'll be able to get the full PowerPoint slide with all the different information that I cover here. So moving on. Track 2 is diplomacy. I won't spend too much time on this, but this was the ASEAN Day, the 56th anniversary, earlier this August and the 8th. This was dialogues between multinational NGOs, which are just non-governmental organizations. Kind of an interesting little term there, to promote understanding informal cross-border discussions to further cooperation. Very, very bureaucratic speak. And then ASEAN has been China's largest trading partner for 3 consecutive years. So that means all the bloc together has been their largest trading partner. Obviously, with the U.S., we import the most amount of things from China. China is really the number 1 trading partner for a lot of countries, but very, very interesting when you look at that. When you look at foreign direct investment, trade flows, import, export, a lot of countries imports a lot from China, but China doesn't import as much from them. So interesting when you look at that. And then trade between China and ASEAN countries reached $428.96 billion in the first half of 2023. Wow. Up 5.4% from 2022. And again, these links that I'll have here will be shown if you just ask down below in the description for the link for this PowerPoint slide. Moving on. So the South China Sea, the whole policy here is very, very interesting, actually. Again, the Philippines is much more, to put it in basic terms, the Philippines is much more closely allied with the United States. You can see this if you just study history. A lot of bases in the Philippines, obviously, and tension between China and the Philippines over transport of construction supplies to China's Riana Shao. U.S. has backed Philippines' efforts amidst China's pushback, so China's been pushing a lot back against the Philippines doing a lot of these things. There's a lot of military operations that go on, kind of more shows like North Korea does. A lot of these countries like to do these military shows just to show their really strength and kind of dominance in different regions around the world. The Philippines is definitely one of them, kind of more led by the U.S. And if you travel to the Philippines, it's definitely not my favorite out of all these countries in Southeast Asia, but much more underdeveloped. A lot of issues there. Very Americanized, a lot of American brands, whereas a lot of these more mainland countries, for example, Vietnam, really, really interesting. Cambodia, very, very interesting, where they don't really allow a lot of these American companies to enter. They're more focused on developing local companies. And also, I apologize, part of Southeast Asia during the rainy season is it just started pouring rain. About middle of this presentation, I'm in a very beautiful area in an undisclosed location here, but I apologize for the background noise here. So anyways, moving on. So SCS is significant for many strategic regions, economic, geographic, and sovereign. Lastly, here the sentimental analysis, and we'll wrap it up. So calls for de-dollarization, Russia and ASEAN ties, Myanmar and Russian division. That's very interesting because I won't talk too much about Myanmar, but the Russia division, obviously, I would say it's about 50-50, actually, with some countries just not wanting to talk at all about it. It's obviously Indonesia and Philippines, since Indonesia is actually one of the only 10 that are part of the G20, which is really kind of a US-UK-led alliance. Obviously, they're kind of backing the U.S. stance, but they've kind of been trying to be a bit passive, a little bit neutral, like Switzerland. And then you have Philippines, which always kind of goes along with the United States strategy. And then you have push and pull foreign policy between the China and the United States, and then regional connectivity, Laos, Malaysia, China. They've been developing this new railway to really develop the trade there. Because if you look, again, at the beginning of the video, if you scroll back to Google Earth or you just look at it yourself, you can see the connection there is very, very interesting for multilateral trade or trilateral trade, however you want to call it, between the 3, and then also connecting some of these Central Asian countries, potentially Bangladesh in there as well. All right, so move towards de-dollarization. This is super interesting. This is the last really heavy technical, I guess you could call it, slide, and then mostly just kind of casual from here. Again, I encourage you to let me know down below in the comments if you've been in Southeast Asia, what are your personal opinions? I'll be doing more deep dives into the next 3 countries that I really like to look at out of this block, and in the next 3 videos, and then I'll be moving on to a different alliance, which I think will be very, very interesting. So ASEAN members agree to use local currencies more often and improve regional payments connectivity, a move towards de-dollarization. Basically meaning they're all trying to have this cross-border payment system where, let's say you're in Myanmar and you have, let's say, Vietnamese dong, and you're paying, instead of having the intermediary be the US dollar there, it just goes directly between the 2 currencies without that third-party intermediary, which actually makes sense when you think about it. And all participants signed an agreement to better regional payment connectivity and the use of local currency transactions. Now, BRICS, Brazil, Russia, Indochina, South Africa, another alliance there, they're really pushing this heavy. They've obviously signed on a lot of very interesting countries here in the previous days. I'll be covering that later on, and I've talked about that extensively in past videos. But BRICS is very, very interesting here. Really, the new development bank, the NDB, which was actually head off by one of Brazil's ex-presidents, super interesting if you take a look at that. Very, very interesting to understand. But they're really pushing towards this, obviously, for global trade. You don't want these countries don't want to continue using the US dollar through the petrodollar agreements, which are kind of old, outdated. They want new banks, more quick payments, not using the SWIFT system that's very, very outdated, that's really made for pre-2000, to be quite honest. And then central banks of Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, Singapore, and the Philippines have implemented contactless QR code payment systems, which basically enables, like I said before, direct currency exchange, bypassing USD as the intermediary. All right. So Russia-ASEAN ties, ARSOM. So the 19th ASEAN-Russia Senior Officials Meeting, ARSOM, was held in Siem Reap, Cambodia. Beautiful, beautiful place. On April 29th, 2023, so earlier this year, the meeting reviewed the developments between ASEAN and Russia and discussed ways to strengthen cooperation in a number of areas. The two sides also agreed to hold the 11th ASEAN-Russia Summit in 2024. Russia has reaffirmed the support of ASEAN centrality, basically meaning that they'll hold their own centrality. They won't be really influenced, let's say, by places like the G7 or the UN or the US or the UK or Europe, all these different people that kind of come in with their NGOs, these different, which I love that name, non-governmental organization. And it really influenced basically the foreign policy. So basically they talked about that, a term used by the ASEAN diplomats to describe the bloc as a leader, driver, and institutional hub of regional cooperation in the wider Asia Pacific. Conclusion and personal perspective. I hope you guys enjoyed that. Again, this is kind of a return video. I've been doing a lot of traveling. I think in the past 2 months, something like that, it's almost been like 15, 20 countries. It's been wild. 4 continents, something like that. So it's been a lot. I'm very excited to be back doing the videos, different businesses that I'm working on across Latin America, Europe, North America, even here in Asia and Africa. A lot of different things going on in personal life, but I'm glad to be back doing these videos. I'm really, really interested in ASEAN. It's really one of the bust-out regions in the world to really keep your eye on. Now, one of the things that I do want to mention with this, I do work with clients on things like migration, investment migration, so acquiring residencies, citizenships, different visas in countries, also setting up bank accounts, different brokerage accounts, real estate. Here, there's a lot of opportunity for, I would say, equity play, so setting up brokerage accounts, which you actually have to physically come. There's some ETFs, Vanguard funds that you could do from a lot of Western countries. But at the end of the day, you want to come and set up brokerage accounts. If you need any help with that, obviously I can help people. But one major thing I do want to emphasize is that with real estate, be very, very careful. If you come here looking for real estate, I'm more than happy if you contact us via the email below to help people out with different real estate opportunities around the region here. But be extremely careful. Pretty much the law almost everywhere here in Southeast Asia is that most foreigners, unless they're partnered up with the local or they have a business, there's different ways around this. But really, it's a freehold lease, so really you don't technically own the land. There's a lot of risk there. There's a lot of opportunity with arbitrage, so renting it out, and long-term renting, basically short-term renting it out to different people on like Airbnb or VRBO. A lot of different business opportunities, but be very careful in this region of the world. I have absolutely loved it. I think it's beautiful. I really like Southeast Asia. I really like Central Asia. I think Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, these are all super interesting places in the world. A lot of people don't know about them. Most people like the good test. I think George Gammon talks about this on The Rebel Capitalist. But really, if you mention one of these countries to maybe a family member or a friend, if you live in most Western countries, let's say US, Canada, UK, Australia, and their immediate reaction is like, what? What's that place? Isn't that a war zone? Like those are typically the most interesting countries because the sentimental analysis is very, very easy to do if you conduct it yourself. Also, if you're here, try and learn the language, try and speak with locals, try and do all these things. Like go out of your box, don't just stay where you're at, and really do boots on the ground research. That's what I personally prefer doing. Try and meet with local politicians, try and meet with local bankers, try and meet with local businessmen, people running hotels, all these different things, vitally important. Make the connections. A lot of these things you just can't find online, and those are the markets that I'm personally most interested in. More frontier, emerging markets. Like I said, I've loved my time here. The weather's fascinating. I love it here in Southeast Asia. Here, Africa, Latin America, I would say the Balkans and Europe. Some of Eastern Europe's a little bit heavy right now, but some places around the world are just fascinating at this moment. And I hope everyone's doing well, staying happy and healthy. And thank you very much again for watching the video. Encourage everyone to go check out the PowerPoint slide. I'll have that link down below. If you have any questions, you want to contact us directly. If you want to hop on a call with me, everything will be linked down below. investglobal.io is the website. There'll be an email link down below if you need any help with anything. And wishing you guys all the best. We'll be more regularly uploading here in September, moving forward for the rest of this year. And I hope everyone's doing well. Cheers.